A city in a forest. Why doesn't this exist? Well, technically, some cities are in forested regions. Atlanta even has the nickname City in the Forest, and places like Taipei or Singapore are famous for their greenery, but none of them really feel like what I imagine. Half city, half forest, where skyscrapers and trees are truly sharing the same space. It seems almost impossible, but I want to see if it can be done, so I want to try building one in Minecraft. If a forest city is even possible, it has to start with the terrain. Normally I would quickly build the landscape using the Axiom mod in Minecraft to get close to my idea, like these mountains from my Solarpunk project. But for this build, terrain plays a critical role, so I decided it was time to learn World Painter, an external tool for making large custom landscapes in Minecraft. While I was working on this, I kept thinking about architects who have thought about this problem before, like Paolo Soleri. He was an influential architect and believed architecture and ecology should function as one system, and that by integrating them, cities could grow more naturally and be better places to live. It made me realize that for this project, the terrain really plays an important role in the build and should be more than just a backdrop for the buildings. Which brings me back to the terrain. Of course, the trees will do most of the heavy lifting, but the ground needed to be equally as interesting. So I made a river snaking through the center and built up the topography around it. I was playing it safe at first with some shallow slopes, but eventually built them up to more significant ridges and mountains so they'd have more of a presence. And normally, it's way easier to give yourself a flat area for buildings and pathways, and then shape the ground around them afterward. But for a true forest city, buildings have to be designed around the natural features of the site, like the existing trees or slopes. So even though it'll create challenges later, I tried to keep most of the terrain as natural as possible with lots of hills and ridges. Once I was happy with the terrain, I brought it into Minecraft and added cracks, rocks, and texturing with Axiom for detail. I also added a pond and a waterfall, where I imagined one of the more scenic areas of the city. Now, anyone who's followed along with my videos over the years knows I tend to avoid making custom trees. I could say it's because default Minecraft trees help show a sense of scale and familiarity for the viewers, but the truth is, I just don't like building them. They're difficult and random and kind of funny looking. Even the few custom trees I have made was with a 3D modeler, and you can see how those turned out. Clearly that was not going to work for this project, so I just had to grit my teeth and try to make some good trees. It was also important to make them somewhat realistic because in this build, the forest is part of the city, and if the trees didn't work, then the project would fall apart. I knew that I needed a range of sizes and tree types, so I found a couple of reference images of an evergreen tree and deciduous tree to help guide their appearances. It was a slow process, but one thing that helped me a lot was a new video from one of my favorite builders, Shovel241. In it, he built some of the most insane trees I've ever seen in Minecraft, and it was perfect timing because that was just the inspiration I needed to build the rest of the trees. Placed them around, making sure to keep it random, but after I finished, I noticed something was still missing. The area lacked that canopy feeling you get when you're in a forest, and so I realized I needed a way bigger tree. Large custom trees are among the hardest things to do in Minecraft, but don't just take my word for it. Here's Shovel.
Making custom trees in Minecraft is an art form all on its own. It's a block-based game, and trees are basically the exact opposite of blocks. That's because every tree is unique. They've got curves, weird angles, and all sorts of irregular shapes, which makes them pretty hard to pull off in Minecraft. Getting a tree that actually looks good usually takes a lot of patience, plenty of trial and error, and way more practice than you'd expect.
At almost 200 blocks tall, this is officially the biggest tree I've ever made, and I'm honestly pretty proud of it. What do you think, Shovel?
Hey, not bad. Little small for my taste, but other than that, it looks pretty good.
Well, I'll take that as high praise coming from you. Once the tree was complete, it was pretty easy to throw together some smaller plants and place them around to help fill some of the empty spaces. In real-life architecture, every site comes with constraints that need to be considered throughout the design process. Things like site conditions or local zoning codes. Luckily, this is just a game, so I'm not breaking any laws when I demolish a house while the owner is tending their garden. But even in this hypothetical build, where there are no codes to follow, there's still the forest that needs to stay intact. When I've designed fictional cities from scratch before, I could usually just place everything exactly where I wanted, but this time, every building had to respond to the trees and the topography, and this conflict shed some light on why I think there aren't any cities like this. A true city in a forest doesn't exist because cities and ecosystems both need a lot of one thing: space. As cities grow, the soil, water, and ground cover that ecosystems rely on get replaced by asphalt, concrete, and large buildings. And even where nature remains, natural cycles like animals sleeping and foraging get disrupted by noise, light, and pollution. And that's why blending the two is so much harder than just keeping them separate. So I kept that in mind while I started designing, but other than that, I really didn't know where to start with these buildings. I began with some elevated forms that sort of resembled a treehouse. As for materials, mass timber has been growing in popularity because of its sustainability benefits and pleasant appearance compared to concrete or steel. And it seemed perfect for this because there would obviously be no shortage of wood. Then I found a nice block palette that worked well with the wood and added a lot of green roofs to help make it feel connected to nature. As I finished the first building, I stepped back to look at it, and it really felt like it belonged, and like the style might work nicely when applied to other buildings of different sizes and shapes. I was imagining an entire city made up of this aesthetic and got pretty excited to finish it. So I began rapidly sketching and making more buildings to about 80% or so. I didn't want to lose any momentum by getting bogged down in the details. Plus, finishing them all at the same time will actually help make them more cohesive. After making about 10 buildings, some of them began to remind me of a real-world structure. It's this really obscure building that only the most well-read architects will know about. It's called Fallingwater by Frank Lloyd Wright. You may have heard of it. Okay, you've probably heard of it. Fallingwater is famous for its seamless integration with the landscape. Part of it literally sits on a massive rock, and it has these iconic cantilevers that stretch out over the waterfall and ground level. In terms of blending architecture with nature, I'd consider this to be the perfect example. The reason that I was reminded of it is because of how its form occupies the negative space between the trees and the ground. This helps to solve the problem of conflicting spatial needs by allowing the ground level to remain primarily for nature, while most of the building sits above it, enjoying the view. This is what a lot of my buildings were doing, which I think is why they seem to be working so well. So I continued building, leaning into this concept of filling the void spaces created by trees and terrain. Once the area started to fill in, I added a few significant buildings that a proper forest city should have. Like a food hub, which could be a place for community gardens and markets, and a biomass power plant, which could turn decaying plant matter into energy. And of course, a city hall, designed to be the centerpiece of the city, while still following the mass timber and green roof aesthetic. The result is a building that feels kind of old and classical, yet slightly futuristic because of the material and form. To connect all the buildings, I tackled transportation next. Any modern city needs some roads, at least for service vehicles, garbage trucks, and deliveries, but I wanted to add them as efficiently as possible so they'd have minimal impact on the forest. I decided on a loop road that would go around the entire city, preserving the center where rails and pathways would help people get around more easily. The rails were pretty simple, just 3 elevated lines meeting at the city center, one to the food hub, one to the city hall, and one connecting to the outer loop road. Even though most of the buildings had green roofs, larger parks are still a crucial element of any city, and for many people, it's their favorite place to be in a city. I decided to turn this center peninsula beneath the big tree into a park, since it's a nice central location and the surrounding buildings formed a nice enclosure around it. And it was kind of an accident, but the pathways ended up resembling a leaf, which is fitting for a city like this. Another perfect place for a park was right next to the city hall. Underneath the building made a really great place for a public plaza, and it had convenient access to the rail, plus it overlooks the pond, helping to complete the scenic area by the waterfall. Then I started making some detail elements, which are really just miniature builds that I can use Axiom to copy around to multiple buildings wherever they fit in. So a few windows, balconies, signs, mechanical equipment, antennas, plus some solar panels I made earlier in the project. This next step was crucial for tying everything together. I added lush but controlled green roofs to every building, which helped make the buildings feel more cohesive and related, while also helping them feel fully integrated with the nature around them. The trick was finding the sweet spot, having them look good and lively, but not so overgrown like they weren't being maintained. By this point, everything was coming together, and there were just a couple quick things I had to do to finish the build. I did a quick pass on texturing all the buildings so they'd look slightly more realistic, and I finished it off with a final round of plants, using smaller trees and ground cover to fill in any leftover empty spaces. Now that the build is finished, I want to use what I learned to think about whether a true forest city like this could actually work in real life. To do that, I'll look at it across 3 points in time: construction, living in it, and the future. First, the construction. Cities aren't usually built from scratch, but even considering a single building is telling. In Minecraft, I can place buildings with one mouse click, but in real life, construction takes years, hundreds of people, and heavy equipment. So trying to build something like this inside an existing forest without seriously impacting the site would be extremely difficult. Next, we'll consider living there. Let's say the buildings somehow get built. How do they function day to day? Nature needs space, and people need room to move. Some conflicts could be addressed with design moves like elevating the buildings and pathways, but major risks would still remain, things like forest fires or serious storms. And finally, the future. Over decades, trees grow, die, and fall. Forests are changing constantly, and buildings do too. They need maintenance, renovations, and sometimes demolition. All of that becomes much harder when both are occupying the same space. I'd love to say a full-on city in a forest just like this is possible with a bit of clever design, but realistically, it's pretty unlikely in today's world. That said, master plan projects are getting bolder and more progressive all the time, like a lot of Stefano Boeri's work, or the Forestillas, a residential master plan under construction in Bangkok that's centered around a large forest. So who knows what could become possible in the future? A true forest city like this may be out of reach for now, but it's still fun to think about, and maybe something in this video got your gears turning. If so, leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, consider sharing it with someone else that might find it interesting. Thanks for watching.